In this episode of EcoSense for Living, we look at how interacting with nature is essential for our health and well-being.
The difference between a medicine and poison often comes down to two factors: dose and intent.
I've never said that nature was safe or risk-free. It's part of its attraction.
I think we, as humans, we don't really think about how important it is for other species to be able to get from place to place.
An international team of scientists is searching the world for life-saving medicines. It may sound like a movie plot, but Dr. Cassandra Quave leads this real-life mission to tackle one of our greatest challenges.
Bottom layer, the sediment. When modern antibiotics were developed, there's no doubt that this was a huge game changer. It was probably the game changer in medicine. You can imagine that some of the earliest patients would have a scratch on their thumb from gardening and get a serious staph infection. And, treatment with penicillin was able to take people from the verge of death to the living again. And it was just truly miraculous. Now, antibiotics are natural products, meaning they come from nature. However, they're not typically coming from plants when we think about classic antibiotics. They come instead from soil microbes. The reason that we're so interested in identifying new solutions for antibiotic resistance is that we're really facing a major issue right now. We're fighting one of mankind's greatest threats to medicine currently, and that's the rise of antibiotic resistance. A recent report that was put out by the United Kingdom government showed that today we lose around 700,000 people globally due to untreatable infections. And by the year 2050, this number may rise up to as many as 10 million a year. This will not only affect people that have very serious infections, but it could also affect our ability to treat cancer patients, our ability to have simple surgical procedures. It will make childbirth much more difficult and dangerous. There are a lot of different areas of medicine where antibiotics are absolutely essential. And so we need to find not only new antibiotics, but also new drugs that can help restore our existing lines of antibiotics. I'm a medical ethnobotanist, and that means that I study the ways that people engage with and relate to plants when it comes to medicine. And we have, by the way, many, many different forms of traditional medicine. There's Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, Unani, Jamu, Kampo, Native American medicines, European herbalism. They're basically anywhere in the world where people have lived and survived within these different environments. They have developed a major system of medicine. And what surprises a lot of people today is that we still have around 80% of the population in the developing world that is reliant on plants as their major form of medicine even today. And for those of us that perhaps get our medicines from the pharmacy, we too use plant compounds because many of the drugs that we find today in the drugstore actually were originally discovered in plants. When you think about plants that have really changed the world as we know it today, this one is definitely at the top of the list. This is quinine tree, or cinchona. And cinchona bark was harvested by native peoples of South America historically to treat intermittent fever. It was also used to treat malaria. And in fact, we had huge amounts of this bark that were exported to Europe and were used by Europeans to then enable them to explore other parts of the world that were very heavy in malaria. This is also the source of a compound that gives tonic water that delightful bitter edge. On Earth, we have around 391,000 species of plants. And out of those, roughly 7%, or 28,000, have been documented as being used by humans as a source of medicine. Our full research approach really takes 4 unique places. The first is, of course, anywhere out in the wild in the world. So we are working in multiple continents with collaborators across the globe. The other place is the herbarium, which is where we deposit all of our specimens, those pressed plant specimens that go into a museum-like record that can be accessed and worked with for hundreds of years.
All the specimens come in and they're dried. They're brought over here to be stored and pressed and nice and preserved and digitized. So I've seen plants all the way from like right outside this building all the way to Italy and Kosovo, which is really cool. So it's like a little tour of the world within this one room, along with the herbarium back there.
This is where we store over 20,000 specimens of plants, and some of them actually go back to the 1800s. In the past few years, during my ongoing research across the globe, we've added several thousand to the collection. This is the phytochemistry lab. This is where we study the compounds that we pull out of the plants and see if they have any drug-like qualities. And lastly, we have the microbiology and cell culture lab, which is where we test those molecules against different forms of infectious disease and also counter-test them for safety against human cells. There's a common saying I tell my students, and it is that the difference between a medicine and poison often comes down to two factors: dose and intent. And this is a great example of both a poison and a medicine. This is the Madagascar periwinkle. You may have seen this at your local garden shops. It is used as an ornamental species, originally from Madagascar. But what's fascinating about this plant is it has a history of association with witchcraft and kind of magic. And whenever I hear witchcraft and magic, I immediately think, well, there's some interesting chemistry at play that people are attributing these characteristics to it. What was fascinating about this particular plant is that it spread into the Caribbean and was being used by people as an anti-diabetic medicine. I want to talk a bit about a concept known as plant blindness. It's this idea that people are really attracted to animals and things that are moving, and yet plants are kind of just seen as this vast green tapestry of ambiguous organisms, and people don't really give them much thought. But as a botanist, when I look at a natural environment, I am viewing, just amazing diversity of life. One of the things that I really try and do with my students at Emory is I try and take the plant blinders off and get them to stop and look away from their phone, right, and actually engage with the environment, because there's just a sense of joy when you start to recognize plants, when you go on that forest walk and you can point out, oh, I know what that is, or this plant's used as a medicine, or this is one that's safe to eat. There's a lot about our research that gives me hope. I'm an optimist, and I know that while we do face some pretty big challenges when it comes to drug resistance and when it comes to conservation and dealing with factors like climate change, at the same time, I know that there are some really promising strategies that are being implemented for conservation and some really promising strategies in the laboratory. And some of the things that I encourage people to do is to get involved with your local native plant societies, to attend courses or workshops that are made available at science museums or at botanical gardens, and start to learn a bit more about your world. You can also self-teach. There are lots of great guidebooks that you can take a look at on your hikes and see if you can match those wildflowers with what's actually in the book. And slowly, a bit by bit, you'll start to see how the world reveals itself to you. And it's just amazing.
Time spent in nature is becoming more crucial to our health and well-being than ever. Richard Louv, author and co-founder of Children in Nature Network, is once again breaking new ground. So tell me about Our Wild Calling. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, one of the things I've noticed about the research on the impact of the natural world on human health and well-being is that almost all the studies are on green space. There's very little about what wild animals do to us in terms of our health and spiritual health, physical health, mental health. Medical people now talk in increasing numbers about the rise of social isolation in the world, not just in the United States, and that loneliness is about to surpass obesity as a cause of early death. It's associated with all kinds of diseases, not just suicide. And it turns out, that the urban parks with the highest biodiversity are the ones that have the best impact on us in terms of our psychological health. I don't think that's an accident. We are desperate not to feel alone in the world. And it turns out that we're not alone. We're surrounded by a larger family, a neighborhood of animals. We need to start paying more attention to wild animals and to our domesticated animals.
So do you feel that if humans get more connected with wildlife and different species, that they'll want to protect them more?
Nobody protects what they don't love. And when we intellectualize environmentalism, we don't do the environment any favors. Increasingly, environmentalism itself has become math, has become numbers. We have to count the inches that the sea is rising, no doubt about it, but we can't intellectualize it to the point where we no longer feel it in our heart.
What do you feel is a way to get people connected, to get them out and to have these experiences?
One of the suggestions is that we form in cities wildlife watch groups at the neighborhood level, in which, the kids and the parents and the retirees down at the corner create essentially a club where they agree to watch the animals, the wild animals in particular, that come into the neighborhoods, and learn about them. One of the things that's happening in a section of the book is called The Betweens, and it's about the number of animals, wild animals, that are moving into cities. These are called neophiles. That means they're attracted to the new. There's several animals that are particularly attracted to the new. Crows, coyotes, raccoons, and to an extent bears are moving into cities or to the edge of cities. Ironically, even as we have more nature deficit disorder than ever and less connection to nature, there's more opportunity around us, even in urban areas. And most of us now live in urban areas. So that poses dangers because some of those animals are dangerous, but it's also a great opportunity to connect with those animals, to learn about them, to have them enrich our lives. I mean, just walk down the street with a dog and you'll have people talking to you. Well, the same is true when you know about the wild animals around you. That's one practical way to deal with the conflict that's definitely going to come with more wild animals in the cities. Where I live, there are mountain lions. That's not always a good thing. But I've never said that nature was safe or risk-free. It's part of its attraction. There's a guy named Gordon Burkhardt who is a scientist, herpetologist. He says if you're going to study a snake, you have to sit with a snake. Conjure up in your mind all of the hard science you know about how that snake is perceiving the world. What's it like to be that snake? He says only after you do that can you really ask the right scientific questions. This is not anti-science, it's pro-science. It means we have to ask deeper questions about the life around us.
So what are some creative ways you see people getting closer with wildlife and nature?
I think, obviously there are the traditional ways to connect with nature, hunting and fishing and all of that. And I think digital photography is a good thing. I think this storytelling about other animals and our relationships with them is kind of primal to us. I mean, our ancestors told them around campfires and about the adventure they had with the bear that day. And as they told them, they not only told them verbally, they often acted them out, became the bear. Today, a lot of people do that on YouTube. People are talking often about the unlikely partnerships between species, across species barriers. I think one of the reasons that's so popular is because we want to cross over the barriers with people of other races, people of other economic backgrounds, and with other animals. We don't want to be alone in the world. There's a theory that we domesticated gray wolves. As they came closer to the campfire, we threw them bones. And over time, a long time, they became used to us and dependent on us. But there's another theory that they domesticated us. And by this theory, we may have followed packs of wolves as they hunted and watched how they cooperated and collaborated. And maybe we learned something from that about cooperation, about family life. You know, primates, early primates, not a barrel of laughs. They're not really kind often, but you watch wolves as a family, and they may not be kind to other animals, but they're kind to each other. Now, in this research, the German research, these guys actually use the word ethics, wolf ethics. What if gray wolves passed an ethical frame of mind to the dogs they became, and then today those dogs communicate some of those same ethics to us? Turns out that dogs do something with people that only dogs do, and only people do. When you and I look at each other for the first time, we look in the left eye of the other person. Only dogs of all the other species do that. Wolves don't do that with us, only dogs. I think that kind of connection is so important for all of us, but particularly for kids.
So if you had just your dream for Our Wild Calling, what would you accomplish with this book?
Well, one thing is simple. I would like people to tell more stories about their experiences, because this is maybe the last issue that we can come into the same room and maybe even to the same table together, because nobody wants to be in the last generation where it's considered expected for kids to be able to go out and lie in the woods and watch the leaves move. There's an amazing amount of good things happening and good-hearted people. One of the things I've noticed is anybody who's working in that cause, for that cause, whether it's their profession or whether it's as a volunteer, this is a happy cause. This is happy work. How many happy causes do we have left? So it's growing.
Right hand, you're going to hear its heartbeat.
When we talk about the southern border, wildlife rarely enters the conversation. But one person spent a decade studying animals affected by new barriers to their age-old survival.
There are people who would pit the idea of wildlife protection against the need for some sort of immigration enforcement. What I say to that generally is walls don't work. There's been no proof over the past 10 years of wall building that it's had any impact on the number of people coming here. I had an assignment for Wildlife Conservation Magazine back in 2008, and that took me to the border of the United States and Mexico at New Mexico and Chihuahua, because I was working on a story about a transboundary herd of bison that had basically disappeared for 70 years and was sort of rediscovered by scientists. And we were up in a plane looking for the herd, and we saw them right as they were crossing what was the U.S.-Mexico border at the time. And we went to the landowners on both sides of the border, once we got back down on the land, and asked them what they knew about the bison. And on the U.S. side of the border, the rancher said they come almost every day to my land to eat a certain kind of grass. And on the south side of the border, the rancher said they come almost every day to my land to drink from a pond. That's one of the only year-round water resources in the area. And so it was really clear that their food and water resources were split by this border. All deserts have animals. It's a misperception to think that they don't. But the Sonoran Desert has an especially wide variety of animals, and they're there because it's essentially a wet desert. The truth of this place is that it's one of the most biodiverse places in the nation. And as you go up in elevation, you get all of these different species that can live precisely because there are mountains there. You have black bears, jaguars, cougars, bobcats, all sorts of species that otherwise might not be able to live in a desert. Sonoran pronghorn, which is a very highly endangered species, they frequently cross back and forth across the border. Kit foxes go back and forth as well. Basically, any species that lives in the borderlands, if they're within a few miles of the border, there's a good chance that they are using resources on both sides of the border. They were starting to build the first miles of border wall that were mandated underneath the Secure Fence Act of 2006. And so it was clear that this barrier was going to divide the food and water resources for this one species. And I just started thinking about, well, what's that going to do for all of the species that live along this border and to ecosystems and to people? So from that point on, I started focusing my work on trying to tell the stories of wildlife and ecosystems and people on the border so the people that were elsewhere in the nation could understand the impact of this barrier. This is one of the most important places for birds in North America, and there are more than 500 species of birds, one of the highest bird diversities anywhere in the United States. Birds and butterflies, insects, a lot of people would think this is not going to affect them. They can fly, but it's not the case with a lot of bird and insect species. There are some birds that simply don't fly that high. So the Cactus ferruginous pygmy owl, for one, doesn't really fly over 12 feet in general. A lot of places, the barrier is already 15 feet to 18 feet. Some places, it's up to 30 feet. And it's getting taller with this new round of construction. So it will affect birds that don't fly high. A lot of insect species do not fly high. And when we build the wall, we go in and we tear out their host plants and the plants that give them nutrients to survive. And so the wall will have a huge impact on butterflies, on birds, on insects because of the habitat loss. The wall is not a solution, I think, is the bottom line, and it's expensive. You know, it's billions and billions of dollars for this thing that does not stop people, and it creates all of these ripple effects that are so destructive to the natural environment. Our most bedrock environmental protections have been waived along most of the U.S.-Mexico border. The Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, everything that's meant to protect not only wildlife from extinction, but human beings from having dirty water and dirty air. All of those laws are gone so that the government can do whatever it wants. I've talked with a lot of people over the past 10 years, people that live on the border, right on the border, and are facing their firsthand impacts to their own land or land that they work on. And they're frustrated. They feel helpless. Many of them have gone to Congress, have called Congress, have asked them to protect the wildlife and the landscape and even their own land. But they feel like they're not being heard. There are still groups they're working very hard to change the policy. So the Sierra Club, Defenders of Wildlife, Center for Biological Diversity, Earth Justice, a lot of groups are working to try and fight back against the policy of border barriers and militarization that's impacting wildlife. And a lot of other groups are still working on the restoration side to try and help recreate wildlife corridors that have already been severed. I think we, as humans, we don't really think about how important it is for other species to be able to get from place to place, whether it's for their morning breakfast or a drink of water or a mate, or because the climate has become untenable and they have to find a new place to live. At the time when I started studying these bison in the border, they were one of only 5 free-ranging herds of bison left in North America. But that herd is small and it's important, and anytime you separate a herd of animals with a barrier, it causes all sorts of problems for that herd. If we care about wildlife, if we care about biodiversity, without hesitation, we have to protect the current corridors that they have. And because we've done so much fragmentation of their habitat, we have to recreate pathways for them that they can use as the decades move forward and things get harder and harder for them. I think that the most important thing you can do is participate in democracy. Both Democrats and Republicans have supported border wall over the past 10 years consistently. Definitely vote. But it's actually more about reaching out to your members of Congress all the time. You know, follow up on what they're voting on. How do they vote on budgets that contain money for border wall? Pick up the phone, give them a call. I mean, I know people feel like that doesn't matter, but it really, really does. I've talked to members of Congress, and I know that the reason why border walls are still getting built is because people are not picking up the phone and saying, I'm angry about this, I want it to stop, and I care about animals, and I want them to be able to survive.